I wasn't expecting her to say it like that. The way she leaned slightly toward me, one hand on the desk, and said, "Close the blinds. Let's begin your real lesson." It wasn't the words themselves that caught me. It was the space between them. Like there was a second meaning resting just behind her tone, and I wasn't sure if I was meant to hear it. The repair shop smelled faintly of grease and brewed coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate too long. Outside, late afternoon light slid through the blinds in thin, dusty stripes, landing across her workbench where a disassembled carburetor sat in pieces. She was wearing the same navy coveralls I'd seen her in last week. Sleeves rolled just enough to show her wrists, skin pale against the dark fabric. I pulled the cord and the blinds rattled shut. The room dimmed instantly, muting the gold from the sun, until all that was left was the glow from the desk lamp at her elbow. She didn't look up right away. Her fingers moved over the parts on the bench with the kind of care most people reserve for fragile glass. "If you want to learn," she said, "you have to stop letting everyone outside watch you fail." It was blunt, but there was no sting in it. Just precision, like she'd measured her words before letting them go. I tried to think of something clever, something that would make her smile, but my throat felt tight, so I just nodded, stepping closer to see what she was working on. "You hold the float like this," she said, pressing the small brass piece into my palm. Her hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary, warm from the lamp's heat. I pretended to study the part, but every nerve in my hand memorized the shape of her fingers. She had this way of speaking without looking directly at you, her gaze always on the work, the tools, the problem. But every so often, she'd glance up sharply, as if checking if you'd caught something she hadn't said out loud. I asked her how she learned all this, and she told me about her uncle's garage, about spending summers there as a teenager. She left out dates, but I could picture her. Younger, maybe laughing less than she should have, hands already oil-stained. At one point, my elbow bumped the desk and a washer rolled off the edge. I bent to grab it, but she was faster. She caught it mid-fall, her hand brushing mine. Just a brief contact, but enough for the air between us to feel heavier when we straightened. We went back to work in silence for a while, the tick of the cooling engine outside filling the room. I found myself listening for her breathing, the faint exhale whenever she focused on loosening a stubborn screw. Eventually, she stood back and crossed her arms, assessing the pieces we'd laid out. "Not bad," she said. "You pay attention better with the blinds closed." I wanted to ask what she meant by that, if it was about the lesson or about something else entirely. But she'd already turned away, the moment folding in on itself before I could hold onto it. That night, I kept replaying her voice in my head, like I missed something, or maybe wanted something. The next time I saw her, the shop smelled faintly of rain. Clung to the doorway to her hair. She was leaning over a workbench, frowning at a wiring diagram, the sleeves of her coveralls pushed higher than before. There was a faint smudge of graphite near her jawline. "You're late," she said, without looking up. I stepped inside, wiping my boots on the mat. "Traffic." Her mouth twitched like she almost believed me, then smoothed into that unreadable calm again. She went back to the wiring, tracing a line with the tip of her pencil. "Grab the toolbox," she said. "The red one, not the blue. You'll see why." I carried it over and set it beside her. She opened it slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding too loud in the quiet. The storm outside was tapering off, leaving only the faint hiss of tires on wet pavement. She handed me a wire stripper without looking at me, then showed me how to grip it. Her hands moved with practiced precision, veins visible beneath the skin. I noticed a small scar across the base of her thumb, the kind that comes from a sharp slip and a moment's inattention. She caught me staring. "What?" "Nothing," I said too quickly, fumbling with the tool. A faint laugh escaped her, not warm exactly, but not cold either. More like she was amused that I'd been caught watching. "Focus," she murmured. guiding my hands with hers for just a second longer than she needed to. She kept her eyes on the work, but every so often her voice would soften unexpectedly, especially when explaining something complicated. And in those moments, the guardedness seemed to lift, just slightly, like a door left ajar. I noticed how she rubbed at her temple once when she thought I wasn't looking, how her laugh faded too fast, as if she'd remembered she was supposed to be serious. There was a tiredness in her eyes, not from the day, but from something older, heavier. At one point, a drop of water fell from her hair onto the bench. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed it away with the back of my hand. She froze for half a breath, then cleared her throat and stepped back, tucking her hair behind her ear. We didn't speak for a while after that. The only sounds were the rain easing off outside and the occasional metallic click from the tools. I kept stealing glances at her profile, the way her jaw tightened whenever she was concentrating, the faint crease between her brows. When we finished, she rested her palms on the bench and exhaled slowly. Her shoulders relaxed, but her eyes stayed distant, like her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but didn't, and that silence felt louder than words. It was later than I'd planned to be there. The rain had started again, softer this time, the kind that makes the street outside look like a watercolor painting. She was still at the bench, a half-empty mug of coffee beside her, the steam long gone. "You're still here?" I asked, setting my bag down. She didn't look up. Deadlines don't care about the clock. Her voice was quieter than usual, like the night had worn it down. I moved closer, offering to help, and she didn't argue, just slid a set of blueprints toward me. We worked side by side, our shoulders almost touching, the desk lamp throwing a pool of warm light that made the rest of the shop feel darker than it was. At one point, she leaned over to check my measurements, her sleeve brushing against my arm. Neither of us moved right away. "You're getting better," she said softly, her breath warming the side of my neck. Something about the way she said it made me want to tell her. Something. I didn't even know what exactly. Maybe about how I'd started coming here more for her than for the work. Maybe about how I'd been noticing the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled. Not as flaws, but as stories I wanted to hear. Her phone buzzed then, cutting the thought in half. She glanced at the screen, and her face shifted. Not much, just a subtle tightening of her jaw, but enough for me to see the change. She silenced the call and slid the phone face down on the desk. "You don't have to pretend I didn't notice," I said before I could stop myself. She gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We all have people who think they can still call." The quiet after that was different, denser. I could hear the rain tapping the windows, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner, even the sound of her shifting her weight. I wanted to ask who it was. I wanted to ask why she sounded tired when she said it. But I didn't. We finished the last of the diagrams in silence. My pencil rolled toward her, and when I reached for it, our fingers grazed. She didn't pull back. Not right away. Her eyes flicked to mine, holding there for a heartbeat too long. My hand was halfway to hers when she said, "You should go now." And I did. But only my body left that room. The shop was closed for the day. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. I'd stopped by to drop off a tool I'd borrowed, but she was still there, sitting on a stool by the workbench, elbows resting on her knees, staring at something I couldn't see. "You could have just brought that tomorrow," she said, her voice flat but not unfriendly. "I was in the neighborhood." It wasn't exactly true. She gestured toward the bench. "Set it there." I did, but I didn't leave. The quiet was heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She ran her hand along the edge of the bench, fingertips brushing over a deep scratch in the wood. I wondered how many years she'd stood here, and how many stories were etched into those marks. I leaned against the opposite counter, watching her. "Can I ask you something?" Her eyes stayed on the scratch. "You can ask. What are we doing?" The words slipped out before I could arrange them into something softer. That made her look at me, not sharply, not with surprise, but with a kind of tired curiosity, as if she'd been waiting for the question and dreading it in equal measure. "We're working," she said finally. "That's not what I meant." She didn't move, didn't blink for a few seconds. "I know." The silence after that stretched so far it felt like it might snap. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge in the back, the occasional pop of the cooling pipes. I stopped, because every way I tried to finish the sentence felt wrong. Too forward. Too much. "It doesn't feel like just work." She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except it wasn't. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not trying to." Her gaze dropped to the floor, then back to me, slower this time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. And in that stillness, I could feel something shift, like we'd both stepped too close to a line we could no longer pretend wasn't there. I thought about crossing the space between us, about putting my hand over hers on the bench. But something in her expression made me stay where I was. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, like she was already mourning something we never even had. It was one of those evenings when the air outside feels thick, like the whole sky is holding back rain. I stopped by the shop to return a stack of manuals she'd lent me. She was sitting at her workbench, the desk lamp the only light in the room. "Just set them down anywhere," she murmured without looking up. I did, but noticed something. An old photograph tucked halfway under her coffee mug. It was faded, corners curled, the kind of picture that had been carried around too long. In it, she was younger, maybe my age, standing next to a man in a grease-stained shirt. His arm was slung casually over her shoulder, both of them smiling like they'd just finished something worth remembering. I didn't mean to stare, but she caught me anyway. "That was a long time ago," she said. Not defensive, not sad, just cautious. "Who's he?" I asked before I could stop myself. She hesitated, tapping her finger against the mug. "Someone who taught me a lot. Someone who's not here anymore." There was more in the pause than in the words. I waited, unsure if I should press. "He died," she added eventually, her voice lower now. 10 years ago. Motorcycle accident. I was supposed to be there that day, but I wasn't. I didn't know what to say. The air between us shifted, heavier, but not suffocating. Like we'd stepped into a part of her life she didn't share often. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. Her eyes met mine for a second too long, as if she was weighing whether to say more. "You remind me of him sometimes," she said finally. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because of who he was, but because of what it meant, that I'd been walking around this whole time carrying a shadow I didn't even know existed. She stood and busied herself with a stack of parts, but her movements were slower now. I wanted to ask what, exactly, I reminded her of, my voice, my face, the way I learned from her. But I stayed quiet. The rain finally started, tapping against the windows in soft bursts. She leaned back against the workbench, her arms crossed but her posture looser than before. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she took a breath like she hadn't allowed herself to in years. And for the first time, she looked at me without fear. The shop was almost empty of sound, just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the hum of the desk lamp. She'd closed early, locking the front door before I even arrived. I found her sitting on the floor by the workbench, back against a stack of unopened boxes, a mug of tea balanced on her knee. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You're here late," I said. She nodded toward the space beside her. "So are you." I sat, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans. For a few minutes we didn't speak. She sipped her tea, eyes on the wall opposite us, as if the answers to every question we hadn't asked were painted there. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "About what?" Her shoulders lifted and fell slowly. "About how much easier it would be if I kept you at arm's length. About how much I don't want to. I felt my pulse in my throat. You don't have to. She gave a faint smile. Not the polite kind, but the sort that made it feel like she just decided something. I think I already failed at that. We let the quiet settle again, but it was different now. Less guarded, less tense. Her tea was cooling fast and she set it aside. Without looking directly at me, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. Not tentative, not testing, just there like it had always belonged. The heat of her skin seemed to anchor me in place. I didn't squeeze, didn't pull away. I just let it be. You scare me, she said softly. Not in a bad way. Just, you make me forget all the reasons I've kept to myself for so long. I wanted to tell her I understood. That the way I felt around her didn't fit into neat sentences either. Instead, I shifted closer until our knees touched. She leaned her head back against the boxes, eyes closing for a second. I don't know where this goes, she admitted. Me neither. We sat like that, knees touching, her hand on mine, the lamp casting our shadows across the either way it feels settled. I've learned that love, or whatever this is, doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet, through the habit of showing up. Through small, ordinary moments that pile up until one day you realize you can't imagine your life without them. She hasn't told me everything, and maybe she never will, but she's let me see more than she shows most people. The sharp edges, the stories she keeps folded in the back of her mind, the parts of her that are still healing. And I've learned to stop, but every time she hands me a tool without looking, every time her hand brushes mine and doesn't pull away, every time her laugh slips out before she catches it, I feel it. The night air smells different when we lock up now, warmer even in the cold. And as we walk out together, I catch her glancing at me in the reflection of the glass door, the hint of a smile tugging at her mouth. Maybe this isn't the kind of story you can tie in a bow. Maybe it's better that way, because the truth is, she didn't save me and I didn't save her. We just found each other in a quiet place between the things we were running from. And somehow that was enough. If you've ever had someone like that, someone who changed you without ever saying the words, you know what I mean? And if you haven't, maybe you're still looking.